My name is Pete Mather, and I serve as the chair for the Department of Counseling and Higher Education. In a moment, I will introduce the panelists. In the meantime, I would like to ask people to mute your mics and turn off your videos unless you're a panelist. We do invite you to put information in the chat, but we will wait to address questions and comments until after the panelists present. But before introducing the panel, I'd like to provide some context for today's conversation. We're emerging from another incident of the tragic murder of a Black man, Rashard Brooks, in Atlanta by someone whose job it is to protect and serve citizens. This is another in a series of events involving unnecessary uses of violence by police and vigilantes in this country. We are in a time when racists have been emboldened by the presence of white nationalists occupying the highest positions in the U.S. government. Victims of this reality include immigrants who experience forced family separations, LGBTQ people who are being stripped of their rights, and Indigenous people who continue to live with injustices of colonization. While these are important human rights issues, our focus today is on the assault on Black lives in the United States. We've become familiar with the unthinkable recent events, such as the brutal murder of George Floyd, as well as the lost lives of Ahmad, Brianna Taylor, Rashard Brooks, and many others that preceded these. This is a time when we see the coronavirus pandemic and the accompanying unemployment crisis disproportionately affecting Black people in this country. We've also seen disenfranchisement of Black people in the electoral process, recently illustrated by the primary elections in Wisconsin and Georgia. On the other hand, there are signs of change. Public opinion regarding systemic racism has shifted at an amazing rate. Diverse crowds of people are protesting the systems of oppression and dehumanization that give rise to these realities. Hopeful examples include in-progress legislation that outlaws deadly police practices such as chokeholds. NASCAR has announced a ban on Confederate flags at their events, and the NFL has acknowledged that its position on respect to player protests was wrong. Our question today is, how do we affect change in our roles as university educators, as members of this community? As we come together today as an Ohio University community, we consider that higher education has a purpose in contributing to progress, including promoting human rights and dismantling racism in the greater society. But we also recognize that higher education itself is the product of a cultural system of racism. In fact, higher education in America was founded as a whites-only enterprise, and we still live with the legacy of racism within as well as outside of our institutions. Our panel, which represents different experiences and identities, will address these issues, and our goal is to come out of this with ideas that all of us can implement in our lives and work to confront the issue of racism in society and here at Ohio University. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I have posted more complete biographies in the meeting chat. First, we will hear from Dr. Akil Houston, an associate professor in African American Studies at Ohio University. Dr. Houston is an alumnus of the Patton College, having attained his PhD from the Cultural Studies and Education program. His work is wide-ranging and includes hip-hop culture. He also examines subcultures and social movements, particularly as they connect to the African diaspora. He's been researching recently how subcultures develop and affect change in society. Dr. Houston will be followed by Dr. Courtney Koestler. Dr. Kessler is an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education and the director of the Ohio Center for Equity in Mathematics and Science at Ohio University. They have served as a classroom teacher, including working with K-5 students, teachers, and families in culturally, linguistic, and economically diverse communities. Dr. Kessler's research and practice center on diversity, equity, justice, and critical pedagogies in pre-K through 8 education, teacher education, and mathematics education. Dr. Yegan Pillay is our third panelist. Yegan is a native of South Africa and As of August, will be professor in the counselor education program. Congratulations, Dr. Palais. His major research interests include diversity and social justice issues, racial identity, development of racial and ethnic minorities, and he is a leader in his profession in areas of multicultural counseling and human rights. Our final panelist is Dr. Mona Robinson. Dr. Robinson is professor of counselor education. Prior to her work at Ohio University, Dr. Robinson served as clinical counselor and administrator of vocational rehabilitation, counseling, and employment services to persons with severe mental illness and other barriers to employment. Dr. Robinson researches, teaches, and holds leadership positions nationally in the area of multicultural counseling. She speaks worldwide on issues of cultural competency. And I'd like to thank each of these panelists for offering their time and expertise today to this conversation. We will begin with the panelists responding to a couple of prompts, and then we'll invite questions and comments from the audience in the meeting chat. And the chat will be monitored by Dr. Connie Patterson, who's the Assistant Dean for Engagement and Outreach in the Patton College. So, Dr. Houston, we begin with you. Please share some of your experiences and perspectives at this time as an educator and a citizen that relate to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think probably most obviously is what I bring to the table in terms of my identities is the most obvious connection. In addition to that, it's part of my professional work, and being in African American studies is something that we consider to be part of our calling as a discipline that focuses on those who are on the margins and bringing the margins to the center, to paraphrase Bell Hooks. It's a tough time. I think without stating the obvious, we've seen more attention on something that has been happening for quite some time. So for those of us who are just now protesting, just now seeing, welcome to the party. I could speak at length at my experiences. There are a litany of things that I share in terms of people who have lived in this space dealing with white supremacy. But I won't go into that. I think more importantly, and hopefully what a lot of our conversation will be around is solutions. I think we have a great assemblage of scholars, and I think we could speak very in depth and at length about what the problems are. So I think that what I'd like to do is to sort of condense my time and focus on solutions and what's next, what are some practical things that we can implement, what are things that we can do on a personal level, on an institutional level. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kessler. You're muted, Dr. Kessler.
Thank you. Hi, as Pete mentioned in my intro, I'm a proud former public school teacher, and those experiences as a teacher and my current work out in schools has shaped who I am, both professionally, personally, and politically. I'm a white person, and most of my teaching experience was in culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse communities. I grew up near Dayton, Ohio, in a suburb that was middle class or upper middle class. And my teaching experiences were with kids that had very different worldviews, and their families had very different worldviews because of the cultural and linguistic and economic diversity. And I learned a lot from those experiences, working with people who were different from me and understanding that there wasn't universal truths. And so that really shaped who I became, not just as a teacher, but who I became, like I said, personally and politically. In that work, I was introduced to critical literacy and how to do that with very young children. So I learned as a young professional that we can do critical work with very, very young kids. So thinking about how to introduce curriculum that includes attention to racism, sexism, gender, disability, and other really important issues, and starting with kids' life experiences on which to build. I think sometimes Parents and caregivers and teachers especially are really worried about talking about difficult things, race and racism, because they're worried that kids are somehow innocent or don't know about these things, but these are what kids are experiencing. And we need to talk about these things with kids, or otherwise they are scared and they are worried about these things. So in particular, my work is really, a lot of my work centers on math education. And so a lot of it is talking about thinking about how to work with people around seeing math education as not just raced and classed and gendered, but also racist. Thinking about who is privileged and oppressed in our racist systems, like tracking, who is positioned to succeed or not. So since 2014, I've been working on a project called Access, Agency, and Allies in Mathematical Systems. And that project is really working together very closely with elementary, middle school, and high school teachers to unpack privilege and oppression. And it started out looking at what it looks like in classrooms, but we realized as a team that we needed to look at it in sort of a systemic view. What it looked like in districts, community, what race and racism, how that impacts not just what we're doing at a classroom level, but what it looks like in districts, communities, institutions, and structures. And it was in that project for the last 6 or so years that I'm starting to learn about what it meant when people started saying that people were saying that schools and universities instantiate a culture of whiteness, and they perpetuate white supremacy. That's when I started to understand what that means, and I'm still understanding it. I began to understand what it meant to be an ally, and that it's important not to just speak for others, but with others. I also began to understand that it's not enough just to be an ally, that I also have to stand up and be an accomplice, or what Dr. Bettina Love says, a co-conspirator. So in this project, I realized that a lot of my work along this journey of my professional career has maybe been non-racist, and it's simply not acceptable. I need to think about how can I work to be anti-racist. So that's a little bit about where I am in my journey.
Thank you, Dr. Kessler and Dr. Pillay.
Thank you, Dr. Mather, for this invitation, and thanks also to the esteemed group of colleagues that are on this panel. And I think this all started with an email from Dr. Mather, and I am pleased to see how this has all evolved, and we have our dean's involvement in the college, so I'm appreciative of that. So to be honest, when I started, when I was invited, I had some hesitancy about being on the panel. And I wanted to not run the risk of being a token person of color on the panel, and also to be the voice of individuals in the group that I belong to. So I want to make a disclaimer that I speak for myself, and I'm not representing any particular group. Oftentimes, I find in the Western-dominated environment that individuals get pigeonholed, and in part, I mean, this has been some of my experiences in the United States. So as Dr. Mather had mentioned, I originate from South Africa, and one of the other reasons for my hesitancy has been around, am I qualified to talk about Black Lives Matter? And I pondered that, and when I accepted this invitation, I was immediately reminded about an individual who has. I've quoted this individual in my work on diversity, and this individual wrote a poem during the Holocaust, and he was a Lutheran pastor Niemöller, a German pastor, was originally a sympathizer with the Nazis, and we're talking about, is penning this poem during just as a reaction to the Holocaust. And I've added to it just very briefly, just to provide a context before I say a little about myself. And his poem goes this: he says, "First they came for the communists. I did not speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists. I did not speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak up because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak up because I was not a Jew." And the little pieces that I've added to his poem here is that then they came for the slaves. I did not speak up because I was not a slave. Then they came for the disabled. I did not speak up because I was not disabled. Then they came for members of the LGBT community. I did not speak up because I did not belong to that community. And then they came for the African American. I did not speak up because I'm not an African American. And eventually they came for me. And there was nobody there for me. So I use this as a backdrop just to kind of contextualize a little bit of my background and what my role as an educator and what's going on currently. So I grew up in South Africa, and yeah, it's an interesting parallel. Almost 54 years ago, I was a student in 1976, 18 years old, and the parallels are uncanny. The younger generation, like myself at that point, were tired of the older generation being so, we consider them to be dragging their feet in terms of the liberation struggle. And so the youth became restless. And what I'm seeing currently, and so the older generation became tired of fighting the system, and one can understand they're fatigued. So the youth took over and took to the streets, and that pretty much, in a nutshell, and I encourage you, if you are not familiar with the history of apartheid in South Africa, is to Google it and find out more about apartheid. And so this really literally was the turning point in the history. And what I'm seeing currently in the Black Lives Matter movement, and what I'm seeing, what's encouraging, and I'm seeing in the protests currently going on, is the involvement of youth. And in South Africa, we refer to the group was the Mass Democratic Movement. And so, so very, very fascinating parallels. And so part of my kind of becoming conscientized to the movement was I joined what was known as the University of the Left, the University of the Western Cape, where I literally cut my teeth on the liberation struggle. So I'm going to pause there, and I agree that we should spend some time focusing on solutions and how to move forward here. So I'm going to pause there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Pillay. And
Pete, I'm sorry. This is Connie. I'm going to ask.
Oh,
I'm sorry, Pete. I'm going to interrupt you real quick. I've been asked to please ask others to mute their microphones if you're not speaking, and we're asking too that only cameras, the live cameras, be on the presenters. And we have comments, but I would like to, please, Dr. Robinson. Sorry to interrupt.
All right. And as Dr. Robinson starts, I'm going to be doing my best to share an image, and I'll have it up for a little while, and we'll, but you can take it away, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Dr. Mather. And I will just share, ask Dr. Mather to share the one image. Of course, there are many others. However, perhaps there's some way to share resources later, but I think this particular image that is on the screen now really represents how I will speak for myself, but others are feeling in regards to the Black Lives Movement. When I was asked to do this panel, I hesitated for a moment. I hesitated for a second moment after seeing the makeup of the panel and really the organizers of the panel. But then I decided that a Black voice, Black voices do need to be heard. I think that I'm going to read this just for a moment because I really want you to hear what this is saying, because this really frames my comments, and it also will frame the comments that I make later. But I do feel that we cannot be allies. We cannot stand up and have a movement and really mean that Black Lives Matter without everybody taking a look at themselves. So the other piece is that I was very specific about, I'm here today to represent Black lives. We said Black Lives Matter. We never said only Black Lives Matter. We know all lives matter. We just need your help with Black Lives Matter, for Black lives are in danger. So Blacks are facing a serious crisis in this country, not only in this country, but in this university, on this campus. And so when we talk later about some solutions, I hope that we will focus on some solutions for the racism that Black faculty are experiencing on the Ohio University campus. So 3 points. Number one, Black lives matter and Black people are hurt, angry, and tired. Racial trauma is real. It's painful. I have a resource that I'd like later for Dr. Mather maybe to send out, but one of those resources talks about overt and covert white supremacy. Generally, overt white supremacy actions are viewed as socially unacceptable, but that makes up the tip of the iceberg. But there are many covert white supremacy practices that continue that are socially acceptable, and I think we need to attack some of those things. The other piece in regards to racial trauma, just want to mention that it results in feelings, psychological feelings, stress, pain, hurt, anger, fear, and it's relived. And I know for me personally, it's been relived as this whole Black Lives Matter with the protests have come up. It's caused a lot of trauma for me. So was another reason I hesitated to participate, because of the feelings of anger and hurt that have come up in regards to protests that have gone on and continue to go on across the country, but also the things that I have been, I've had to endure at OU, and I know that others have had to endure at OU as Black faculty. So as a citizen, as a young child, I grew up, had kind of limited understanding of the 1960s protests and race riots after the brutal assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. I do, however, have a vivid memory of the race riots that occurred in the early 90s as a result of the beating of Rodney King by the hand of police officers. Today, I'm appalled and horrified by the callous and brutal murders of Black citizens that continue. Even this past weekend, there was another murder of a Black man at the hands of police officers. But in terms of recent murders of Ahmad Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and most recently, Rashard Brooks, just to name a few. The list goes on and on. It's exhausting. But many of them who were killed on camera by police officers who were sworn to protect them. I've been a faculty member for the past 15 years at OU, and I've been the object of, as well as witnessed, many racial injustices. And so I am hoping today that when we talk about solutions, that we can focus on some solutions to address those issues. I think we continue to face institutional and systemic racism in our universities, our cities, and our country. And I want all of us to take a part in stopping racism. There's things we can do to stop these racist practices in communications, in tenure and promotion processes, and in opportunities for advancement for Black people. One of the other things that I wanted to mention, I was very specific about, I am not speaking from a vantage point of people of color, because oftentimes we are lumped in as Black people with people of color. And I think it's easy to overlook many of the injustices that Black people encounter. So in that regard, and the other reason is because we're often discriminated by people of color as well. So I want us to be very intentional to know that in terms of the Black Lives movement and Black Lives Matter, we have to be intentional about our thoughts and our practices towards Black people. And finally, why is it important? Why does Black Lives matter? Because every time you discriminate against us as Black people, you put your knee on our neck and we can't breathe, and we're fighting for our lives. And that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. And I, for one, am grateful that you're here with us today. And as we go to the next question, which I think really is where we need to be, and that is kind of as Dr. Robinson was teeing up, looking at some of the specific strategies that offered from our panelists that members of the Patton College of Education and the university community can adopt in order to effect change, both at the individual, the institutional, and the societal level. So with that, I turn it back over to Dr. Houston.
Thank you, Dr. Mathers. I think I want to say that I share the trepidation that Dr. Robinson mentions, that Dr. Pillay mentions, because being at Ohio University means that, you know, typically when you're called upon, it's for the Black issue, and not so much for your research, your scholarship, the other things that you bring to the table. Sometimes it happens to work together where the two meet, but too often are you called in to be the Black voice, which is problematic. But I think what we need to first start doing is to deal with our entrenched racism as a university. The quick, let's have a scholarship, let's have a meeting, let's have a panel. We do that too often. And we can talk and talk some more, but there's nothing that's concrete, nothing that's institutionalized. And when it is institutionalized, more often than not, it disappears. So I think there are diversity study certificate programs that exist that give our students access to this kind of information. We should be making sure that those are institutionalized, that they are funded, and they aren't the first thing to go when we talk about budget crisis. Also, if we have women and gender and sexuality studies programs, we should be thinking about how we can expand them, you know, so that our students can understand that, you know, Black people have different experiences. So if you're a trans Black man, you know, what does that look like? If you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, what does that look like for you? What are your life chances? And in those spaces, some of those classes from a curricular standpoint could be addressed and dealt with. Too often we lump the Black experience into the Black male experience, the Black heterosexual male experience. And even within their own community, other Black people get otherized. So that needs to be something we need to deal with on an institutional level. We often say, well, what can we do? We have an African American Studies department, which in my estimation could be funded a lot stronger than what it is. We need to ensure that these longstanding institutions that we have on our campus that in many ways have opened the space for other marginalized groups need to be funded. And there are issues around budget, there are issues around the different things that are happening at our university currently, these should not be the first to go. Unfortunately, one of the trends in higher ed is when we do see budget challenges, it's the diversity office, it's multicultural programs, staff, and support, it's African American studies. And this has been the pattern before I got into higher ed and while I'm still in higher ed. This has to stop, because what it says is, as an institution, when we feel the slightest bit of pressure, those things that we consider worthy of being cut will go. So it means there isn't much moral muscle behind these efforts. We can make great diversity and equity inclusion statements, but I think what gives them life, what gives them meaning, is when they are happening in practice on our campuses. We need to value the voices that we have in our academic community that have been talking about these issues for a number of years, not just these trending moments of importance. So I think, at an institutional level, if I could bullet point these, there is a letter that's circulating on social media that was put together by members of OU Black faculty. It's not every single Black person at OU, but it's the people who are part of it. And I think what they've done speaks to what I would suggest. Some of the things that they are highlighting, I won't go into great depth now, but I will highlight a couple of them, is to begin to speak to Black faculty when it concerns what's happening with Black faculty, staff, and students. Too often, we don't consult our Black faculty. Not saying that I am the point person for deciding a scholarship, but nobody in my department was consulted. There weren't roundtables or conversations about best practices, about how we can enact meaningful change. So too often, one of the reasons why many people are hesitant is because they're not asked. And then when they are asked, it's sort of, thank you for your service, this was great, but essentially we're not going to implement any of the things that you've suggested. So after a while, after you see that, you're less inclined to engage, and this has a horrible impact on morale. The other action items I think that they've worked out is, what are your measurables? How are you tracking some of these issues on inequity? And then what are you going to do in the long term? So if we're seriously interested in increasing our enrollment of diverse populations, have we looked at the numbers? Our highest numbers of enrollment of marginalized groups, specifically African Americans, dates back to the 70s. And we've not done a good job on the main campus of ensuring that those numbers can continue to increase. I'm not saying that there are not efforts, because there are stakeholders who are making those efforts, but if we look at the numbers, we're not seeing them increase. And one of the challenges continues to be, funding. I understand that in a budgetary crisis, funding is tight, but I also understand that people prioritize what's important. So if we're serious about it, like our budget sometimes for sports, then we need to engage that and say, this is meaningful on our campus, so much so that we're going to fund this program and not have an empty initiative where we ask people to come up with these creative ideas and designs, and we don't have any money to make sure that these things stay beyond a year or two and actually yield some results. So I think, just as an institution, we could do a better job in terms of curriculum. We could do a better job in terms of funding. We could do a better job in terms of ensuring that when we recruit Black faculty, that we're doing things to keep them here. So what's it like to be mentored as a Black faculty member? Are there people in your peer group that understand the experiences that you have as you're going through the tenure process? Are there people here that want you to be here, that want you to earn tenure and see success? Are they opening up publishing opportunities? Or are we just putting people off in these silos where you hope and pray that you get tenure so that you can leave? That's something that needs to be addressed. A couple of other things, and then I'll yield my time, that I think this letter points out is that, raise faculty salaries. You have a number of instances where there's inequity in pay, and the differences are based on gender, based on race sometimes. So I think we really need to think about, what it means in terms of really practicing these ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the last thing I'll say is, we can't keep responding to incidents when they happen. We have to be consistent. We have to be prepared to engage in the long run. So while things happen and there are needs for healing, there are needs for conversation, one of the things can better equip us for the future is if this becomes part of our everyday practice, so that we're better equipped mentally, psychologically, and we're preparing students who can enter into a workforce and understand that when you live in a white supremacist society, what's happening is not abnormal. This is actually normal. And we need to make sure that we stop the practices that keep this going from an institutional perspective and really put our meaning, not just, in terms of a public face, but put our meaning behind what we say we're going to do. What I mean by meaning is the off-camera work that needs to be done, the conversations, the shifting of priorities, and quite frankly, some people at our university who are used to doing things the way they've always done them. That needs to shift. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Houston. Dr. Kessler, would you like to step up? You are muted, Courtney.
Thanks. I appreciate what my colleagues have mentioned about their hesitancies about being part of this panel. I think, to me, it seems like it's just another marker of whiteness or white supremacy, that it's just shows how oftentimes institutions are reactionary, that this is not part of our institutional culture or a regular conversation in our programs or departments or colleges, that and then it's a rush to put together a panel like this. So I appreciate that they said that. So I just wanted to say a couple points, and my suggestions are for other white people who are joining today. So my first suggestion for white people is just to start or restart their work in shifting from being racist or non-racist to anti-racist. There's a lot of work out there now to push us along. One of some work that has been really influential in my thinking is Beverly Tatum's work, because we can't be silent. It's a matter of life and death and happiness and hope for our colleagues. I was thinking about when Charlottesville happened. It was right before the semester started, and I realized that I just needed to start doing more. Like, I couldn't start an elementary math methods course with a math problem. Like, it wasn't appropriate. So I needed to start from day one talking with future teachers about how cultural and social and political events really shape the way our kids experience schooling, how little kids, how adults, how those things, and race, how not just cultural, social, and political events, but how racist events shape the way that kids experience schooling. So I know that many of you probably remember what Charlottesville was, but for those of you who might need a reminder, in August of 2017, white supremacists and neo-Nazis came to protest the taking down of a Robert E. Lee statue from a public park. And so there were violent clashes between the white supremacists and the civil rights groups. And eventually someone ran their car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one person, injuring at least about 20 others. So some teacher education colleagues and I met to discuss some possible ideas. And one thing that I did was had an article where we read an article by Micah Pollock called Standing Up Against Hate. And in the article, she talks about three things: engaging facts, protecting the right to learn, and standing up against hate and intimidation in schools. And even that challenged some of the early childhood teachers in my class, that they weren't sure, that it might seem a little bit too political in their roles as teachers. But that's part of it, that teachers need to understand their roles, that they're not neutral, that teaching really is a political act. And so for me, that's one suggestion for white people, that you have to just start someplace, and maybe sometimes even restart what you're doing. That for me in that moment, it wasn't just about embedding kind of this idea that math is race and classed and gendered, or racist and classist and sexist. It was, I needed to start from day one so that we can use that, so that we could use this framework throughout the semester to think about, what does it mean to stand up against hate in a math classroom all semester long?
Thank you. Oh, Courtney. Connie, are you, did you want to raise something from the chat
Well,
before we go to
yeah,
Dr.
there's been a lot going on since the beginning, so I just wanted to give some voice to that. And I'm trying my best to kind of go through the comments and the responses to comments and summarize them so that I can try to make sense of this, because people are responding to different things. So first and foremost, during the introductions, it really took it was a comment that said, from Terrence McTeer, Dr. McTeer, why has it taken another killing of a Black individual to spark these conversations at Ohio University? Seems like we're performing rather than creating actual change. There was another comment in relation to when Dr. Kessler was introducing themselves and said, if we don't talk about these things with kids, they subconsciously or consciously think the white privilege they enjoy has been earned. Black children will begin to wonder, do I matter? And in schools, the message, unfortunately, is often no. There's been a lot of thank yous and affirmations to Dr. Robinson as she was introducing herself and providing some context as to the thought process of participating and then agreeing to and her perspective and her realities. We've been talking about Dr. Ward Randolph was needing implementation of the policies that we do have, and agreement and affirmation with Dr. Houston about the importance of intersectionality. There was some comments too about the George Floyd scholarship, and the comment that that there was a perspective that the scholarship, that they believe the scholarship in the name of George Floyd was important to name, being an unparalleled movement and moment, but it cannot be the only step in the process of moving forward as an institution. And so if it is, then Ohio has taken a step that is insincere, but they do know the idea of putting the scholarship in place was done from a heart of sincerity. And there's been a couple of responses to that in terms of, let's see, the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship is not specified to be given to a student of color as far as they can see, so they believe that to be changed. Another response as it relates to the scholarship was, thank you for the framing to Dean Middleton. Seeing Ohio University acknowledge the significance of this time by establishing the George Floyd Scholarship was one of the few bright points in the personal mourning process. It's meant a lot to the donors, wanted to step back, and that fellow administrators made it happen in a timely manner. Understanding that fellow Black and Brown members of the community are working through the grief process in their own ways, and that anticipate the scholarship name will spark painful feelings and memories. I think there's still some chatter going on here, so I was trying to cut and paste so I didn't have to keep scrolling up and down here. There's been significant conversation about the critical studies program at Ohio University and the diversity studies certificate that was brought up earlier, and some feelings about that being discontinued, and questions about how faculty were involved or not involved. It was made clear that the certificate wasn't going away, just that, again, looking for university commitment in terms of teaching the course and coordinating the certificate. Looking at outcomes that speak to racial equity for Black people on this campus. We talk about progress, but where's the data that supports this progress? 50, 2010, 5 years specifically, there's lip service, but nothing concrete. So there's a lot going on still. I can certainly keep everyone up to date, but if anyone wants to respond to any of the panelists respond to any of those items, I'll do my best to keep summarizing the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. I just want to say, I think kind of a root of a lot of this is, and I'm particularly thinking about some of the prompts about doing the panel when we do such performative kind of work and we're not making a change, and the change requires a much deeper work and deeper action and consistent action than a conversation. And right now, I think I've thought of it about creating space at this time, but I'm also thinking creating space isn't enough. And that's really about cherishing and valuing different voices. And so with that, I think I'll pass it on to Dr. Pillay, who's prepared some thoughts about this as well.
Thanks, Dr. Mather. Yeah, it is indeed a challenging time, and I'm going to start off this segment of my presentation with a short narrative of an experience that I had. I know I shared this with Dr. Mather just prior to when we were preparing for this panel, and so just to kind of provide some general feedback for individuals who are, in the audience currently, and so it provides a perspective of some of my experiences. So I live on the east side of town, close to the Speedway, and not last Sunday, the Sunday before, I was taking care of my grandson, and he is fascinated with cars, and he's watching a movie recently, and there's a trailer that pulled up at the Speedway, and so he was curious as to what was in there, and he remembered the movie. So I walked with him to the Speedway, which I live across from the Speedway, and I was pointing to the trailer. I think may have just touched the trailer. He asked me, "Where's the car?" I said, "It's inside." And then a person came out of the Speedway, stood at the door, and this was clearly this was a white person, and he said in a very harsh tone, "Step away from my trailer. Don't touch my trailer," and went back into the Speedway. And I was completely taken aback. And what this really did for me, and I want to point to when we look at the reaction of individuals on the streets, on your TV screens right now, you have to remember this is years and years and years of pain and anguish and oppression that is laid one on top of the other. And when I had this experience, it took me back at an emotional level. It took me back to my experiences in South Africa, where I was being treated differently on the basis of race, and treated differently and oppressed on the basis of something that I had no control over. And the predominant emotion was anger. And so when we look at emotional states, I think it's important to understand that right now, various people are experiencing anxiety, anger, guilt, amongst many other emotions. But underlying most of these emotions is one of fear. And, when I speak to, for example, when I've spoken to students I'm the advisor of the African Student Union. I've been speaking to some students from Africa. There's fear because the students, when somebody looks at them, they cannot make out the difference where they're from. And so the fear is, will this happen to me? Will what happened to George Floyd happen to me? And so that's something to and as I reflected on that experience, just the understanding that when people are responding, the current killings are the tip of the iceberg. And so this is when we talk about individuals saying we are tired, we are angry. So it's important to understand the context. And what I'm hearing more frequently from the majority culture is, we understand that this was a terrible, heinous act by the police officer in Minnesota. But why is the destruction of property? So let's kind of unpack that. Destruction of property, and I'm reflecting on what happened when I was a student in South Africa, when I was part of the mass democratic movement, is that I think what one has to understand is that this is a projection of anger. So in reality, individuals can't literally go to the White House or to establishments of power and set that alight. Okay, so one has to understand, rather than being judgmental about what's going on, is to understand the context. And what I operate from is a perspective of empathy and compassion. And so having a understanding of where individuals are coming from is, I think, an important starting point. And when I look at compassion, I see compassion as empathy in action. Okay. Empathy is trying to understand where individuals are coming from. Compassion is what are the next steps? What actions can we take to speak to some of what the experiences are of African Americans currently in this country? So when I reflect on this experience that I had, this person that came out of the Speedway also had a son, what appeared to be his son with him, who was about maybe 8 or 9. And so something that one has to recognize is that where do these patterns of behavior, where does these internalized racist tendencies, where do they come from? The family is the smallest unit within which we operate. What do you think that young man is going to take with him from that experience? Here I am. I'm about twice the age of if that was his father. It normalizes that experience, and so the beat goes on and the cycle continues. So what actions can we take? I think lots of these kind of what occurs in terms of racist or other kinds of perpetuation of isms occur in the small circles. So what I would urge individuals to do is, in your small circles, when you are engaging and there's language that's being used about individuals who might be different, this is where the chain has to be broken. This is where one has to tug your whoever you're with, whether it's in the family situation or amongst your circles, tug somebody by the coattail and say, that's inappropriate. That's not the right thing to do. Okay, so, and this is the responsibility that we have. We can use the analogy of, COVID, for example. Okay. As long as it's going to be racist, it's going to be racism. But that's no excuse for complacency. So for example, even though there's no cure for racism, the analogy of we currently trying to maintain the virus by using a mask. Okay, what we need to do is before we utter a statement or before we pass on our internalized prejudices, we need to put on our mask and stop, because it continues through the generations, whether it's with family or friends. So the other is that one has to, as I mentioned, we can become very judgmental about what's going on, especially in terms of violence. I mean, if you look at a burning Wendy's, for example, to understand that where this might be coming from, without labeling all African Americans as violent or criminals, and it perpetuates the stereotypes. And we also need to catch ourselves in terms of becoming aware of our biases and our prejudices. But this has to be very intentional, and we have to be present, and to try and figure that out and try to understand. How are we part of that process of keeping racism or any of the other isms alive? But I think that's an important piece. And importantly, when people are saying we are tired, I can't breathe, I'm angry, it's important for us to listen and understand the context of that rather than making a judgment. You can't be empathic and judgmental at the same time. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Yegan. And as I reintroduce Dr. Robinson as our final panelist. I wanted to mention that the curricular materials that she mentioned before are in the chat, right? If you scroll up to the very beginning of the chat, there are some really helpful curricular materials that she has provided there. So with that, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Dr. Mather. I first wanted to echo what Dr. Palais said in regards to, the anger, the hurt, and some of the destruction. I don't think any of us condone the destruction that is going on across the country. We are about peaceful protest. I will say that some of the fires and some of the destruction that occurred has been done not by Black people as often portrayed in the media, however, by white people who have gone in as instigators to start the looting and the rioting to make people believe that Black people are doing that. So I just wanted to point that out in case some people hadn't heard that yet, that it is not just about Black people destroying property. So I wanted to also, in terms of mention in terms of solutions, I was a part of the group of Black faculty that met recently, and I think Dr. Houston talked about some of the items in the letter, and so I did want to mention a couple of those things. We all are very aware of the current, like I said, the current protests and that are going on across the country and the political scene that is occurring. However, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there are, the protests, there are people, there are work groups, there are think tanks, there are many things going on to try to address racism against Black people. It's been in some of the states, I'm pretty sure Ohio as well, where racism has been declared a public health crisis. I think that in combination with the pandemic and issues that disproportionately affect Black people, that it is time for us to step up to the plate and do some things. So I think this letter and some of the other things that I'll mention in a little bit are good ways that we can actually do something, because to continue to meet and just discuss, I think we're beyond that. And I think that's what the protests have shown as well. Just for us to meet and keep discussing it, no, we've got to move forward. We need some action. And so I'd like us to be a part of that action. I will say again as well, I am very happy to see across the country and on this campus that white people and people of color have better make some changes that will affect Black people. So a couple of remarks from the letter that I wanted to just mention. Let me just scroll down. And like I said, Dr. Houston mentioned some of those, but some of the other things in there, African-American faculty often carry the burden of being viewed as affirmative action hires. African-American faculty have to prove themselves in ways white colleagues don't. Differential treatment and frequent attacks on perceived levels of scholarship, disparity between the workload of Black faculty and that of other white colleagues, teaching service, mentoring, community work versus time spent on promotion and tenure activities. Resistance to the extra workload can be characterized as uncooperative. Those who accept it usually find less time to publish. Both options can jeopardize tenure and gradually dismantle a person's morale. When it comes to tenure, the failure rate of women and minorities is higher than for white males. Recruiting, mentoring, and assisting both students and faculty should be shared by all faculty, not just faculty of color. And where peer mentoring exists, it usually occurs on an informal basis. Many faculty feel uncomfortable mentoring colleagues of a different race, culture, or gender. National salaries surveys show that on average, Black faculty earn less than their white colleagues. Some of the salary discrepancy is due to the following factors: and I didn't pull out all the factors, but one, African-American faculties typically are found among the non-tenure track lecturers, instructors, and assistant professors, which goes back to the previous comment about difficulty getting tenure or promotion. So a couple of things in terms of solutions and things that we can do. Address explicit and implicit racial bias in communications, in tenure promotion processes, and in opportunities for advancements for Black people. Revisit and condemn racist policies and practices that negatively impact Black faculty and students. Mandate racial equity and bias training for all faculty, staff, administrators. Be intentional in recruitment and retention policies related to Black faculty and students. Another point, what can allies do for Black Lives Matters? As I mentioned earlier, many protesters, people taking part in even panels such as this, and other work groups, writing pieces, presenting on different panels, an authentic acknowledgement of racist practices and behaviors. And as I mentioned earlier, recognize that Black lives in the past, and I think Dr. Kessler talked about a couple incidents that have occurred. We can't operate as we have in the past. We have to operate in a different manner in order to address this. And I think we're seeing this across the country and across the world, that this is not, we're going to just protest for a week and then we're going to let things go. We're fighting for our lives and we have to do something about it now. So we do need people that are willing to step up to the plate and confront overt and covert racism when you see it, and when you see practices occurring, and when you're a part of conversations that are meant to degrade and dehumanize Black people. We need you to step up to the plate and help us. And so in regards to, I think on a national and a statewide and citywide level, we've all seen different things that are put in place, and we've seen some of the injustices that have occurred. So I want to take the last couple of minutes of my time to mention just some very specific things that occur in higher education in our college, on our campus. And it's not unique to OU, but I'm speaking about OU. And I broke it down to these specific things that happen because I thought maybe people don't understand, because they're all in this Black Lives Matters and they're all about improving racial inequalities. But these practices continue to occur that hold us down. So I'm going to mention a couple of them. I wrote a few down. Don't engage in racial practices that discriminate against Black people by voting against them when they go up for tenure and promotion. And then vote for a white person who has less contributions, but they are touted as excellent. Voting for white chairs and excluding Black faculty from those votes. Giving white junior faculty priority in scheduling over Black senior faculty. Excluding Black faculty and voting for people of color or white people to serve as chair of PTS committees, using excuses why Black people were not contacted or were not part of the communications when these crucial decisions are being made. And as Dr. Houston alluded to earlier, well, he didn't allude to, he mentioned earlier, talking to students and not consulting with Black faculty. And what I mean is when white students complain about Black faculty, and then white faculty will run and talk to administrators or chairs and make a big deal of it, but never consult the Black faculty. So those are practices, they hurt. They continue to cause harm. And those are things that we can actually change and can actually make changes in terms of improving racial equality for Black people. And so there are many other things, but I'm going to leave that there in the essence of time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, and to all the panelists. Before we go to the chat, I just want to summarize a few things. And we got a wide range of considerations and challenges from the panel, from the gravity of the situation. And I think it's resonating for me when Dr. Robinson said we are fighting for our lives. Then to all of us recognizing large structural inequities and working towards changes, primarily within the institution, but also in society. The collaboration, the importance and value of the collaboration of white and other non-Black faculty in this work, to intentional and routinized practices in our teaching and in our personal relationships, as well as personal searching of our own attitudes. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Patterson if she would like to raise some issues from the chat.
Thank you. And again, I've been doing my best to kind of put some questions and answers or questions and responses together. So forgive me if I've missed something. So early on in the chat, since I've spoken last, there was a statement about the makeup of our board of trustees that needs to change. It's currently 8 white men, 3 white women, 1 Black woman. And the response is, absolutely very true. The state and specifically the governor appoints members on the board. Does this also mean we need to elect officials that have the best interest of all and will contribute to the mission of particular universities? For me, it goes to the larger civic engagement. There were some questions about the logistics of the George Floyd scholarship and some responses, including the legal parameters and being in compliance with Title IX, federal guidelines that prohibit race as a qualifier for scholarships, and then advancement working to be able to write specific equitable scholarships in support of marginalized groups, but currently federal regulation prohibits this as a practice. And if we're not in compliance with guidelines, we jeopardize our federal funding. So then the statement is, well, so how can advancement create a coalition across universities to get federal changes made in order to make institutional change? So I think it does go back to that larger civic engagement. Let's see here. There has been some expressions of anger and fear. Will my son, husband, daughter, father be next? Will it be me? Imagine feeling like the police are not there to protect you. My Black son is not free to be a typical teen in this society. Why does he have to carry the weight of our ignorance? It hurts. Sick and tired of being sick and tired. Imagine if Dr. Palais had that same experience with a grandson at Speedway in Athens, and he looked like George Floyd. So, again, a lot of, just real emotion and questions and really trying to get some calls to action. There were some specific questions that I kind of lumped together so that I started writing some responses. So earlier it was, I'm not a faculty, I'm an administrative assistant who talks to students on a daily basis. What can I do? This is all about faculty. What about students? And what are some proactive actions in the classroom that we as educators and allies can do to advocate for and support change? And so some of the responses are calling out racism of your students. And when faculty rail to do this, it leaves the Black faculty in jeopardy because regardless of whether they are tenured or non-tenured. So you can provide them with knowledge to allow them to see the structural racism and individual racism. Makes reference to bell hooks and having individuals do their own work first, understanding that intentional or unintentional, one doesn't always recognize when the behavior is coming from a racist position, and that's because of their white privilege. We need to do an authentic acknowledgement of the racist students, staff, and faculty. As white people, especially educators, responsible to better educate ourselves on issues of privilege and systematic oppression. There's been a number of different links and resources that have been included. Let's see. One thing is to be helpful of to be cognizant of language and context. This person encourages others to avoid describing racism as a virus, particularly given the immediate context of disproportionate Black deaths from COVID-19. She's heard several times from different people in the university. It can come across as insensitive to the large number of COVID-related deaths of Black people, and it minimizes a systemic and structural problem of white supremacy and Black dehumanization that was and is embedded in U.S. society and all of its institutions, including education. And I'm hearing the dings coming in right as I'm reading all of those things. So that's sort of where I left off. But yes, there's definitely an active chat room.
Great. Well, that is great because it is a conversation for everybody. And I just do want to respond to the administrative associate and as for administrative associates and students and staff, I think everybody would agree this is everybody's work and appreciate everybody's allyship and work on this. But I will open up to the panelists and see if there are other reactions to the chat.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to some of the comments in the chat. So, I've been thinking about, there's a conversation thread now about the scholarship and, why George Floyd is a name. And, frankly, we could name the scholarship after actual people who've been involved at the human rights struggle in OU. There's not a Dr. Francine Child scholarship. And there's someone who, throughout her entire career, was dedicated to uplifting human lives on campus. She was an African-American studies professor and has changed generations of students across the board, despite where you come from, what you look like. That would be a great opportunity if we were thinking about naming a scholarship after someone who's contributed to OU, and then also say this scholarship is for somebody who's interested in social justice. So there's actually some institutional legacy of how important this kind of conversation is. Also, there was a discussion in the chat about what can we do in terms of our classrooms. I think Dr. Ward Randolph made some good comments, and I would like to follow that up with, how are you designing your syllabus? Are there women represented on your syllabus? Are there LGBTQ representation on your syllabus? Is it a representation of diverse ideas, or is it the typical canon, which unfortunately in some instances is largely white, largely male? The other thing I wanted to speak to in terms of the Board of Trustees, while I think looking at certain forms of identity is important, I'm more interested in attitude of mind, because you could have a very diverse looking group on the Board of Trustees, but if they all come from the same perspective, that's not helpful. And to kind of paraphrase Zora Neale Hurston, just because they're your skin folk, don't make them your kinfolk. So I would like to see some representation at that level with people who have the perspective of what's best for our students. How can we ensure that the students who graduate from Ohio University are prepared to enter a global workforce that is more diverse, and not just tolerate that diversity, but actively participating in ensuring that that diversity exists in terms of thought and action. Some other things that I think we can do on our campus is not ghettoize African-American studies or women and gender and sexuality studies. Sometimes students are advised to take these classes because they think it's an easy course. And then when they're hit with the rigor of that particular discipline, they're upset. And then what we see in the anger is the frustration that you have to take women seriously, or you have to take Black and brown people seriously when you thought this was just an easy A, and you make up, papers on fun facts about George Washington Carver. So I think there are some things that we can do when we're having our faculty meetings. We can make sure that diversity is not an addendum, but part of the main conversation. And I think some of the things that were pointed out in terms of who makes decisions, who gets consulted, I think that's important. We've talked quite a bit in my time at OU about shared governance, but what it appears to be in practice is I'm going to tell you the decision I made. Now I've shared, and that's a lot different than having voices, actual consultation, and listening. I think one of the challenges sometimes when we deal with academics, particularly at this level, is, ego can get in the way. And sometimes that ego will prevent us from listening to some very good ideas and people who are experts at what they do. So if you have access to this expertise, why not use it? So if we want to know what's the best way that we can move forward and honor the legacy of those who've been slain, not just heterosexual Black men, but all these folks who've been slain, how can we best do that? Let's talk to the people who are invested in this, who are experts at this. So I think sometimes it's not a matter of let's reinvent the wheel, it's let's utilize the resources we have. One of the pictures, and I'll end my comments here, one of the pictures I used to have on my desk in my office was of a man looking over a ridge. It's a high ridge. And all around him are all these ladders. And the caption at the bottom says, it doesn't matter how many resources you have if you don't learn how to use them. And so in many instances, our university is looking over the ridge, and over that ridge, we see equity and inclusion. We see access, but we have all this expertise around us, all these collections of data that tell us what we should be doing, yet we continue not to use those resources. So I would encourage us that are in positions of power, to utilize those resources, because it's not as if it's impossible. It's not as if there isn't mounds and mounds of research describing these very conditions. It's intentional, I'm beginning to believe, that we're seeing what's possible, but we're choosing not to do it. And finally, I'll say this, that I think the assumption that this is helping Black folks or other marginalized folks, that can't be the impetus for what we're doing. This is for all of us. This is for humanity. So I thought Dr. Pillay's comments about why he's here and his voice and the poem he read, I think that really speaks to this moment. I think James Baldwin said this almost 30, 40 years ago, that Black people are the most obvious victims, but this is a decay of the human spirit in this country. So everybody has an investment beyond, I'm doing this out of some notion of helping someone else. This is about our livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akil. Other comments?
I'd like to amplify what the others have said about the institutional culture of whiteness or white supremacy. I think that sometimes as academics, we can talk about it, or I can talk about it in an academic way, but I think that the more that white people really try to understand what that means and put that into our everyday practice, we can actually start to act on it. So for example, like when difficult conversations about racism come up in our department meetings, do we allow ourselves to stay silent, right? It's really easy to think like, oh, I don't have much to add, and to give ourselves an out. But we all have an obligation not to stay silent. Or do we avoid certain words? Or do we let others, our colleagues, off the hook? Or do we actually challenge oppressive discourse? Or do we challenge people when we think something is racist? Do we allow our white fragility, our discomfort, or our defensiveness get in the way of having really difficult conversations so we don't actually ever make progress? So I think for me, that's one way for white people to actually take actions, because I know that was something in the comments, like, what do we actually do? And for me, part of this journey is when I hear marginalized people say, there's a culture of whiteness in our college, there's a culture of whiteness at our institution, it's part of my job to figure out what that actually means and what I can do to start changing that. And so when I saw this letter written by representatives of the Ohio University Black Faculty Association, I saw that it was written to our the top university administrators, but I also looked at it as an action item. The action item list is things that we could do at the department level or a program level to say, these are things that we can look at to make our spaces more welcoming, more inclusive, more anti-racist, to make our colleagues feel more welcome, because we're going to try to work to be more anti-racist in this space. That it's not just the obligation of the university admin. It's stuff that we can do right here.
Thank you, Courtney. And I'm thinking about the statements people have made about we are a white supremacist institution developed that way, and we have certain customs that have developed out of that reality. So, and as you talk about the kind of dialogue we have in departments, that might not be customary, right? It might not be custom, but where might our customs need to change? So, other panelists?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, I would echo the sentiments of my colleagues in terms of what has been shared, but I think action speaks louder than words. So I think we all have to examine and kind of look at how we can make a difference. And it has to be a collective. And I reflect on Dr. Houston's comments about, we are humans first. Let's treat each other with that type of attitude and respect and compassion and empathy and understand where each one is coming from. So each of us have work to do. Thank you.
I'd like to echo what my fellow panelists have said. I do believe that it will take all of us to make changes in our country and in our university. Black people can't do it alone. People of color can't do it alone. LGBT can't do it alone. Women can't do it alone. We can't do it alone. And there needs to be a structural change overall. But we can do this. And I hope and pray that at the conclusion of this panel, that this is not just another panel that is recorded and goes off into the archives, that we actually take stock in what has been said today, the concerns of the Black faculty, the concerns of the students, and that we take stock in it and that we actually make changes. And as the other colleagues on the panel indicated, we can make changes. There are things that we can do. There are some things that may be beyond our control, but there are many things here that we can immediately and intentionally make changes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Patterson, is there anything else just so you want to summarize from the chat before we close?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of individual comments and really in relation to a specific statement that was made, but some of the bigger things had to do with, in terms of comments made kind of out of the context of a specific statement. Important to note that the attack on Black males is a historically fundamental strategy of the American racist system to keep the entire race under control. The mechanisms to destroy Black males need to be recognized and discussed. While all racism is vitally important, targeting Black males is particularly important given the events that brought us here today. There is a reason there are few Black males on American campuses. Another statement was, as far as what to do to set a tone for our students, wouldn't it make a powerful statement to require all students to take a course dedicated to American cultural literacy? That includes issues of anti-racism, histories that are missing from our current history books. So someone went on to say, the first time I was introduced to a Black author or had a teacher of color was my freshman year in college. My life would have been vastly different had I seen myself in the classroom before then. So there's, again, there's a lot of comments going back and forth about the, the naming of the George Floyd Scholarship and, thoughts on whether that should maintain a name or not, or what that might do to people in terms of re-traumatizing. Asking for, Leadership Diversity Award, and then a variety of different resources that are being shared. So it certainly has been an active chat, and I really appreciate you allowing me to kind of take this role and responsibility in today's forum.
Thank you, Connie. And I do again want to thank the panelists. Everybody had a reason not to participate in the panel, and I think the true sign of the value of this will be what comes out of it. And I think the challenge that Dr. Robinson gave at the end was certainly something that we should all take to heart, because we know that the protests are going to die down. Some of that, the media is going to die down, and the attention is this, but on this is also going to dissipate. So thank you for very active participation in the chat. Thank you again to the panelists. And I want to acknowledge Dean Middleton, who challenged me to put the panel together. So thank you, Renee, for putting this forward and pushing me on this as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Pete, for accepting the challenge and for your leadership and that of the faculty across the college and the institution.